Why are Christians today so concerned about ancient Jewish people? Why do we sing their songs and study their wisdom or learn their history? I'm Adam, and this is After the Fact. This is part of a series on the birth of the Bible. We've looked at the writings of Moses, the Torah, the writings of the prophets, the Nevi'im, and now we're going to look at the other writings, the Ketuvim. This is a collection of ancient Jewish writings that is diverse and eclectic. There are many different genres represented, and yet God works through even these words to speak to and guide his people. So first in the collection is the book of Psalms. This is a collection of temple liturgies, of songs for national celebration, national mourning, personal hymns reflecting on tragedy and joy, thanking God for his deliverance, reflecting on God and his creation. And taken together, these psalms remind us that our emotions are not too much for God to handle. From the lowest of lows to the highest of highs, the psalms express the full range of human emotion as different psalmists cry out to God and thank him for his help. We're reminded that we can come to God with everything within us, and we don't have to hold anything back from him. There's no shame or joy too great for the Lord to handle. Then comes the collection of wisdom literature, the books of Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes. These are a unique and incredible collection of wisdom writings. The book of Proverbs presents a very black and white view of how the world works. This is what it means to be wise, live according to wisdom, and life will go well. This is what it is to be a fool, and if you live your life as a fool, things are not going to go well for you. The book of Job comes and he challenges that assumption of how the world works, and Job presents a story of a man who lives according to wisdom, is a wise and upright, righteous, blameless man, and yet he experiences great personal tragedy and suffering. And so Job explores how is it that even though this righteous man can do all these good things, yet his life still crumbles and falls apart. And it kind of challenges the wisdom of Proverbs at times. The book of Ecclesiastes comes as a third voice, an old man who's lived a long and full life. He's experienced all the joys that life has to offer, all the tragedy that can come as a human living in this broken world. And he reflects on the vanity of life when it's lived for the self and not for the Lord. And together, these three viewpoints form a deep and rich picture of divine wisdom. They tell us of a God who is in control of all things in his world, and yet reminds us that we as humans have a responsibility to live according to the wisdom of God and to care for creation the way that he sees fit. Then we get a collection of stories, two stories in a poem, the book of Ruth, Esther, and the book of Lamentations. Each gives us a view of how God works in ordinary individuals. And so Ruth, the story of a Moabite widow who leaves everything to join the nation of Israel. And we see God provide and care for her as she joins his people, and she eventually becomes an ancestor to King David. We see Esther, an ordinary girl living in Persia, and yet God uses her and raises her up to a position of great power. And then once she's in power, she uses her power and privilege to care and protect for God's people who are threatened by attacks from without. Then the book of Lamentations gives us the reflections of God's people as they lament the destruction of the temple. And these books together give us the picture of how God provides and cares for his people, even in the midst of whether it's poverty, power, or suffering. We see that God is still at work within his people. We get the writings of Daniel and the Song of Solomon, two very different writings that don't fit into any other category, and yet give us wonderful portrayals of who God is. The Song of Songs, as we see just this intense love between a husband and a wife, and we realize that even our marriage, even our sexuality is subject to the wisdom of the Lord, and the Lord has not left us without wisdom in that area of life. And then the writings of Daniel give us this view of God's inscrutable and incontainable plan for all of history, as Daniel writes apocalyptically. And his book is confusing at many times, and yet when carefully studied, it gives us a rich view of who God is and how he works in his world. And finally, the Ketuvim closes with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the book of the Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah, taken together in original writings, present a final history of Israel after the return from captivity in Babylon. And Ezra tells us of the reinstatement of the priesthood and how God works to restore the religion of Israel. Nehemiah tells us of the reinstatement of the political establishment within Israel. And we see that God is still working to uphold his nation. Even though they've suffered judgment and calamity and the Lord has visited on them the punishment for their sins, yet we see God is faithful to his promises. And both Ezra and Nehemiah remind us that God is not done with his people, but he will do more yet. And then finally, the book of Chronicles caps off the entire Old Testament in the original kind of structure of the books. And Chronicles reflects on the whole story, beginning with Adam and ending with history up to the point that it was written. And it shows how God has been at work through every situation and circumstance. It reflects on the blessings of the covenant that come to all of those who live according to God's will. And it reflects on the curses that come as God's people fail to live up to his standard. And so all of these writings, from the beginning to the very end, are considered the inspired, authoritative Word of God. And we love them, we use them, we get our guidance and our wisdom from them. They are authoritative for figuring out how we should live as Christians because we've seen God work in the lives of his people. And that is a fact.